In today's video, I'm going to show you 10 clever techniques for painting flowers using watercolor pencils. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Michele, and on this channel we do all things watercolor, including watercolor pencils like today's video, some drawing techniques, even a little bit of mixed media and motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. Unlike many channels on YouTube, we are fully cat approved, and we'd love to have you join us. Now, if you've seen my work before or you've followed along with this channel before, it's no secret that I love watercolor pencils. I particularly love using them to add details to my watercolors. So whether you use watercolor pencils alone or whether you like to use them like me in conjunction with watercolors, you're going to love this video because we're going to use watercolor pencils to create some really fantastic botanical effects. They're absolutely brilliant for this. You can do things with them that you simply can't do with watercolor alone. Now, I will in this video be using a little bit of pure watercolor paint as well, just for the sake of speed. But if you only have watercolor pencils, I'm going to show you how you can get around this issue and basically turn your pencils into paint right now. Now, if there's one disadvantage to watercolor pencils is that they sometimes leave lines when you want a really smooth effect. So just occasionally it's worth turning them into paint before you start, or using ordinary watercolor paint. So before we start today's video in full, I'm just going to show you how to do that. So here's my watercolor pencil. Now, I've got this Caran palette. This is specially designed for turning watercolor pencils into paint. Don't worry if you haven't got one of these. I'll show you an alternative in a moment. It's got a slight texture to it. So we're just going to draw on it like this, activate it with water, and now my watercolor pencils are turned into paint, and there's absolutely no chance of lines being left behind. So this is just occasionally when you want a really smooth effect, perhaps for an underwash. So maybe you don't have one of these very posh palettes. Let me show you what you can do instead. You can simply use a textured piece of watercolor paper. This is going to work too. The only reason the palette is a little bit better is that some of the colour is obviously going to sink into this paper, so you get all of the colour activated if you use that plastic palette. But this works absolutely splendidly as well. So if during this video you see me using any ordinary paint alongside my watercolours, you don't have ordinary watercolour paint, you just have watercolour pencils, this is what you do. For our first technique, let's make some really natural looking speckles. This is especially useful for autumn hydrangeas, but it can be used for all sorts of other flowers and indeed leaves as well. So I've already put some colour onto this and it's dried. So this is my hydrangea. So I'm working from a set of photographs that I've pasted here onto this page so that I can show the techniques. And we're going to be doing this hydrangea petals here. So we're going to get these little splodge marks on there. And this is something that you see on many petals, but particularly on hydrangeas in the autumn or fall, as you may call it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some clean water. I want the clean water around the outside because I don't really want to lose that lightness at the edges of the petals. I'm going to come around like this. And then I've pre-mixed some green colour here. You may start to see some little veins appearing. And if you're thinking, how on earth did you do that? I've actually been using an embossing tool to get these, or you could scratch with a knife. And I won't go too dark over all of the flower. But what we want is all of the petals to be wet. So I'm working quite quickly. And because I want to keep this pink in the middle here, I'm just going to put clean water down here, just drying my brush so that I don't have too much puddling going on. And then before it dries, I'm going to take this watercolor pencil here. This color is called Aubergine. I haven't really, looked at it or swatched it, but it sounds like it's about the right sort of thing, doesn't it? And I'm just going to pop this down. Now, how much these little speckles bleed will depend on how wet the surface is. And you can see that if I press harder, I'll get harder marks. Now, on the original, they were quite bleedy. Is that a word? They were quite spread out. And I could manipulate this by, going in with a little water and encouraging them to move a little bit. But I know that certainly you do sometimes get harder marks on hydrangea petals The advantage to this technique over splattering is it looks a little bit more natural. You don't get such circular dots. And also, if any of them fall outside of the area you're working, in other words, on the dry paper, they'll just brush off later on. Whereas if this was splattering, I'd have to deal with those because they would have actually sunken in to the paper. I absolutely love this technique. I find watercolour pencils absolutely fantastic for the centre of flowers with a lot of little seeds in the middle, things like daisies and sunflowers. Let's do this one next. So let's look now at how we can use watercolour pencils to get these very tiny petals or seed heads in the centre of large daisy type flowers. So that's what I'm going to be doing next. You can see there are some light dots in here. I'll show you a couple of ways of doing those. Of course, you could reserve part of it with masking fluid, but it doesn't always work well with watercolour pencils because the watercolour pencils may pull the masking fluid off later on. So I'm going to start just by putting a wash of colour in here, like so. And then I'll work into the wet paint with my watercolour pencils. I'm just fading this left-hand side out because we're not painting all of this flower, so just for aesthetic purposes, shall we say. What I'm going to do now is take some darker pencils, and you may want, 2 or 3 colours on the go. And just looking at what we've got there, I can start making some shapes, and very important, sort of darkening the edges here to some extent. And I can even take the watercolour pencil up in between the petals that are coming down in order to get that shadow. And I can start getting either circular marks like this, or I can get a blunter pencil and I can dot in places. Really I'll want a combination of these sort of marks. So while I work on this, let me tell you about the other places where you can find both free and paid help with your flower painting from me. So I have a video about blending techniques that will help you get some of these blended edges. I'm going to show you how to do it in this video later on, but I've got a video on YouTube that explains it in much more depth, so I'll link that in the video description. In the step-by-step playlist, you can find some step-by-step flower paintings that you can do along with me. If you're looking for step-by-step watercolour flower paintings, I've actually got an online course that's got 8 full-length tutorials in. So many of my courses are just basic techniques. So if you're really, really new to watercolour painting and you just can't get your head around it at all, then I have a beginner's course that will just teach you really basic techniques like blending, flat washes, graduated washes, that sort of thing. But if you want those full tutorials, I've got the Watercolour Pencils flower painting course, and actually coming up soon, because you obviously could be watching this video, in 20 years after the zombie apocalypse or something like that. I'm quite sure the zombies will leave YouTube up because, even zombies need some downtime. But if you're watching it in many years to come, then the flower painting course I'm talking about is watercolour flower painting, and that one is going to be ready in May of 2024. So end of May, beginning of June, if I manage to get my acts together quick enough. As I said, if you're watching this in the future, zombies allowing. Now what we can do here is we can, if we want to, we can spread and blend some areas. Perhaps I want more blending in the middle, so I can keep working on this and smudging it in as much as I want to, and you can see we can start getting these beautiful textured effects. Now what about those sort of light white dots? Now I do have a white watercolour pencil, so I can just dip it in my paint water and I can dot. Now this may not be very effective. It's showing a little, if it's all you've got, then it may work for you. The better the brand you've got, the more opaque coverage you're going to get on that. Probably worth letting it dry first. I'm not letting it dry here for YouTube speed, but if you let it dry first, then you'll get less bleeding of the underneath colours. I actually would be inclined in this case to mix my pink paint with a little bit of white gouache and go on top. But you can see how simply and easily we can use watercolour pencils to create the impression of a really complicated area with very little fuss. Many flower petals have very beautiful stripes and marks on, but when you look closely, they're never completely hard-edged. So watercolour pencils work fantastic for stripes and patterns on your petals. Now, some petals like these ones here, I think this is a crocus, these have stripes on. And yet, if you look closely, even at flowers that seem to have really graphic designs on, they're very rarely hard edged. So these are very noticeable stripes, and yet there's still a softness to them. So watercolor pencils are perfect for this. So I've pre-painted these areas here. As I said, I'm going to show you later in this video how to do these blending techniques. And I left this one white because I wanted to go a bit brighter on this one. And this one here, you can see because it's in shadow, I painted the lilac all the way across it. Now I want to wet these areas, but if I'm wetting, for example, this petal here, then what I'll do is I'll start wetting from the top down rather than start wetting from the bottom up, because there's a chance that I could drag this purple colour up. And believe me, purples and pinks and reds run more than any other pigments, which is why in paintings I often do them last, because I guarantee if you go up to the edge of a red area, it's likely to bleed. So wetting that petal, I'm going to start now by shading and bringing some colour up. So this pencil is quite blunt, so I'm making softer marks, but it's also got some sort of much harder edge, darker marks. So I can bring these in with this sharpened, darker violet pencil as well and come in like so. Now I went a bit outside the pencil down here, so it's gone a bit scruffy. So I can either use a paintbrush to tidy that up, or what I can do is just use this sharp pencil to re-sharpen that edge so that we get that beautiful sharp effect. Let's have another go at this petal here. So I can wet the whole petal. I'll start with a little of the more lilac colour, but honestly this one has mostly got much stronger, darker marks on. So I'm going to bring these round. I want to make that other petal stand out. So I'm going to take that dark right up to the edge there and start coming up like this. You notice that again, I'm taking the pencil in the direction of up and out so that those lines naturally taper. It feels a little bit dry down here, so I can take my paintbrush and just re-wet or blend these areas. And I would be inclined not to do this petal next and work straight next to this area where I've got quite dark paint, because it might be inclined to bleed across. So I'll probably let this one dry before I would move on to another petal. And you can see how effectively we can get those stripes. Now, the first technique we did today is also great for pollen and speckles on petals, but there's another way of making sort of dots and marks as well. So I've got a lily petal here, and I could do what I did with the first example and do the pencil shaving things, but actually there are some larger dots on here as well. So I'd be inclined to go straight in with the watercolor pencil. And on this occasion, I want more of a blunt point on my watercolor pencil because we want larger marks. So again, I'm going to start with the water on the white areas so I don't drag that color across. Come down like this. And then I'll take the water over the whole area. Somebody asked me this week on YouTube why when they were re-wetting areas, they were getting drying lines. It's because you're not taking the water across the whole area. Even if you only want paint on one part of your underneath layer, you must take water across the whole thing. Otherwise, you'll notice where you stop. So I'm going to take this pencil here, which is fairly blunt, and I can now use this and just place those dots where I want them. Again, much more controllable than splattering, and I do like splattering for certain things, but this gives you more control. I could even, if I wanted to, combine it with some of the pencil shavings to get finer dots near the centre. Next, let's use watercolour pencils to create the stamens in the centre of a flower. So I've got some stamens here, and I don't want them to bleed into the flower petals. So in this occasion, I've done the flower petals first. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some stamens in and then take the brush onto them. Now, because the stems on these are quite light, I would have been inclined, given more time, to actually reserve those perhaps with masking fluid and do them with the brush first. But you can see that even with lighter colours, we can get something going on here. So I'm going to take my brush now and just paint along those edges using this sharp green pencil just to get a bit of definition. You don't want them to look too outliney, but you can use it in places. Now I'm going to take this reddish brown and put the little end pieces in. Let's take a bit of that dark aubergine colour in for a bit of drama. If something's not showing up, you always want to put some darks in it, keeping them colourful and avoiding too much dull grey or black. And just so these don't look like they've been pencil drawn on top, again, I'll take the tip of my paintbrush and just work into those as much as I need to. And because damp areas will release more pigment, I can go back in and make them even stronger to get some real drama going on. Some flowers, particularly things like African violets and orchids, have sort of outlined petals, but they're still very soft marks. Let me show you how to do this with your watercolour pencils. So I've got a little African violet here. Again, I'm going to go in with clean water, starting on the lightest area and bringing my brush in so that we don't move too much of that underneath colour. It's so important to let your layers dry because watercolour paint naturally has glues and adhesives in it, usually gum arabic, and these actually stick it to the paper. So you're going to get much better results with your layering if you allow things to dry. Now I'm going to take my pencil around the edge. I'm working fairly quickly so the petal doesn't have a chance to dry out. And I can use my paintbrush to manipulate and bring a little of that colour in from the outside edges, simply because that's what I'm seeing on the flower. And look at that for a beautiful result. Next, we're going to do a nice standard, really beautiful, soft blended petal, such as you might find on a beautiful rose. So here I've got a yellow rose and it hasn't got any strong markings on the petals, but it has got these beautiful faded out effects of dark yellow in the middle, fading out to lighter edges. What I've done here is I've pre-painted this so that I've got some soft shadow around the outside and it's dry. I'm going to go in now with my watercolour pencils on dry paper. So I'm going to start shading that colour wherever I see it. As I said, I do have a video that shows you how to do this soft blended edge if you want to in watercolour, but it can be a bit daunting if you're new to painting or if you're just coming in straight from drawing and you want to have the control that you get with using your watercolour pencils. So we're going to shade like this. Where I see darker areas, I can go in with a little bit of a darker colour. So I'll take some dark in here. Being careful not to press too hard because I don't want dented lines in the paper. Now, where people often go wrong once they wet this technique is they'll start on the coloured area and come outwards, and all of that pigment, especially if you've got a good brand of pencil, all of that pigment's just going to spread to the outside edge, but that's not what we want in this case. So this time I'm going to start on this outside shadowed area. There's very little paint on there, so it shouldn't bleed too far. I'll clean my brush again for coming around this centre area. I want to keep this as light as possible, avoiding puddling. And now I can start coming in to the area with the yellow. And I think I've got at least one free watercolour pencils flower tutorial here on YouTube. So that's not a bad result. It's ending a little bit harshly here. So let's clean my brush, dry it a little bit, and I'm going to sweep along that edge just to get a bit more softness there. And here we've got a lovely blended edge without dragging all of the pigment to the outside of the petal. It's not just leaves that have veins, many petals have them as well. They're very fine and very delicate. Let me show you how to achieve this effect next. So off screen, I have got 2 water jars so that I always have some clean water as well as some rinsing water. I've also got lots of this. In the UK, we call this kitchen paper. It is paper towel. Even if we permanently place the roll of kitchen paper into, say, the bathroom or the living room, it remains kitchen paper. I don't make the rules. So this will allow us to control the water levels on the brush. I'm going to add some paint here. Now you can see that I have previously put a light wash on here for some shadow, and this is now dry. So I'm going to go on with a second layer. I'm going to use this watercolor pencil as well. Now I have sharpened this, so it's important for this technique that you have a sharp point, at least if you want a very fine line, as I do in this case. So I'm going to be working with an idea of this petal here. I'm also going to show you later on how to do the raindrops, but first of all we're going to look at these veins. So I'll start by putting clean water around the outside. Now you need to be careful when you're layering on like this that you don't just spread this paint in and across everything, because I want to keep the white here so that the pink on that side is pure. So at this point I'm going to rinse my brush, dry it on the kitchen paper, and I'm going to bring some pink paint across like so. If I remember correctly, this is some Talon's Rembrandt. I think it's called Permanent Madder Lake. I swatched it once against Winsor & Newton Alizarin Crimson and literally could not tell the difference. So it's a nice colour. And now what we're going to do is start putting the veins in. So I'm going on to wet paper here. You see you might get these little bleed lines appear briefly at the end. If they're too much bother, you can just take a damp brush across them, a barely damp brush, and just blend them out, but they seem to be mostly just disappearing here. And you notice I'm working inside out, and that's always important with something that's growing, because you'll get the thickest part of the line down here and then it'll taper as it comes up and out, so it'll look really beautiful and natural. I can also, if I want to, use this pencil to really ramp up the drama down here and put a little bit of extra colour in. You don't want to work on this too long. So I couldn't resist going back into that same flower and adding those little raindrops. Let me show you how to use watercolour pencils to add a raindrop or a dewdrop to your flower. By the magic of editing, this one is now completely dry. Isn't that clever? Almost as clever as me dripping water onto it. We're going to make a raindrop now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this stiffer, cheaper acrylic brush, and in fact, let's make a couple of raindrops. What I'm going to do is just make little circles like this and then blot. What I'm trying to do here is lift out the original paint. Obviously, the darker the paint is, the more that's going to show. So we're just agitating the pigment and blotting. Do not do this with your best paintbrush, because you'll be very sad at the result. So taking out the pigment there where I can. Let's go back onto this one a little bit more. The better the quality of your paper, the more it's going to stand up to this kind of abuse, shall we say. What we're going to do now is we're going to get a sharp pencil and we're going to come round one side like this. Now, raindrops can look all different sorts of ways. Sometimes what you'll get is shadow on an outside edge. Let's try that just for fun. And then you may get some shadow on the inside there, and you'll almost certainly get areas that are lighter in the middle. See, I've got the light coming from two different directions here. Does that make any sense? Who knows, but it looks quite nice, doesn't it? So I'm going to blend that in there. Let's go back in with this darker pencil, really get some drama on that. And just because I've got a bit of dry white paint in my palette here, let's see if I can pick some of this up and add a bit more white in. And this will be some titanium gouache white, and we can pop a bit in there. I should actually fetch my tube of white because it's not re-wetting very well, but anyhow, you can see the effect, and we're just going to ramp up the white there and make some pretty raindrops. Most flowers and plants have stems. They're an integral part of your botanical work. Watercolour pencils can really make a stem look circular and rounded. Let me show you how to do it. So watercolour pencils are absolutely great for making stems look three-dimensional. So I'm going to take some paint up this stem here. I've kind of imagined it to be a poppy, because they often have very interesting marks on the stems as well. And I'm going to come round like this. Now, in order to make something look circular, it needs to be light in the middle and darker towards the edges. So first of all, I can clean and dry my brush and sweep out in the middle. So I've got a bit of lightness down the center, and then straight away, I can start going in with a little bit of darker watercolour pencil. Just think about where the shadow would be. Now, it might be on both sides of this stem, or it could just be down one side if you've got a lot of light hitting the other side. And we can come in like this and start shading. Now, don't worry if it starts to dry as mine is here, because we can easily re-wet. You'll also get shadow underneath the flower. So I'll come in like this, beginning to dry. So let's get more water on it. I can also go in with a darker green to get even more drama. And I can, of course, use this same watercolour pencil to get any markings such as we might have on the stems, poppies, and that sort of bulge that goes behind the flower head itself, using that pencil to add shadow and drama and an idea of 3 dimensions. Now, if you want to know more about the materials I used today or any of the other videos that I mentioned in this video, I'll leave all of that information in the video description. You also want to pop down there because you can grab some free PDFs. There's even 1 or 2 free courses that you can take. Don't forget, I also have that watercolor pencil flower painting course, and coming up later, I mean, it depends, I say later, depends when you're watching this video, but at the time that I'm making it later this spring, that spring of 2024, probably end of May, I'm going to have a full brand new watercolor flower painting course. So excited about this one. You all know it's my favorite subject. So don't forget to have a look in that video description. Meantime, if you enjoyed this watercolor pencils video, I think you're going to find this next one really interesting too.